And I think I'm gonna tell you a little bit about how I ended up doing research like this, how I ended up at the Secretariat. Then I'll just talk generally about this organization. And then I'll walk through a negotiation meeting, like the main elements of it, and we'll look at a draft text too. And then towards the end, I'll talk about the special relationship between the chairperson and the Secretariat, which is what Joanna de Pledge is talking about so brilliantly in the article that we read for today. And yeah, I'll talk a bit towards the end too about just my idea of this power that they have, because I find that to be like the most fascinating part of it all. My research is about climate change primarily, or that's how I think about it. I've been interested in climate change for all my academic career or all my studies in university. But by choosing this place to research, I'm also researching global governance in a sense and international cooperation. And when you do that through field work and through ethnography, which is the methodology of an anthropologist, you come face to face to regular office work, day-to-day bureaucratic practices. So I'd say these three elements are kind of the main elements of what I research. It's climate change, global governance, and then just plain office work, the bureaucratic everyday rituals. Okay, so this is the Secretariat, and it's in Bonn, Germany. This is the main building. But how can I switch slides? Okay, this is awkward. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so that was the main building. We'll look a bit better at it in a minute. But I want to tell you kind of how I got here. My background is all about climate change in a way. I've always been asking questions about climate change since I went into university, but I did my bachelor's in comparative literature, which sounds a bit weird, but I looked at climate narratives in fiction. And then when I went to do my master's in environment and natural resources, an interdisciplinary program in the University of Iceland, I started looking at climate change discourse more broadly and narratives in public discourse, political discourse, and how corporations present themselves in terms of climate change. And then I ended up studying global politics, climate politics, and the discourse and narratives and ideas and conceptions of power that are going on there. So that's kind of my trajectory. And I think I'm still trying to answer kind of a core question I have, which is why is the human response to climate change so terribly slow, so delayed? And I think it's a question that most people that are interested in climate change and climate policy have. Things are moving really, really slowly and have been moving really, really slowly for a long time. And when it comes to this question, you kind of have two main narratives in answer to it. And one concerns the individual responsibility that we need to, the human response to climate change has to happen on an individual level. We need to consume in a green manner and live our lives so we don't emit too much greenhouse gas emissions. And then on the other side, you have another main narrative in response to climate change, and that's the demand for the politics to do something, for systemic change to happen. And I think most people that are interested in the topic, and certainly most activists, they lean towards this systemic change side. They know that you need to change the system. And there's also a logic to leaning in that direction, because if you change the system, you automatically change how individuals behave. However, I don't see it as necessarily an either or. I just want to mention that a lot of the work leans in this direction, but these two narratives can go together. And I think Greta Thunberg is a great example of how they do. Her core message is definitely in the direction of demanding the political system to do something, the grown-ups have to take action, stop talking and start acting. But still, when she appears in media, she performs this individualized virtue of doing the right thing, choosing to sail instead of fly when you're traveling. So she sees some significance in acting out this exemplar, individual exemplar. So I think she's a good example of how both are at play. I just wanted to mention this because I see my research definitely on the side of thinking about how the system works and how the politics can act. And I think initially what drew me to the UNFCCC Secretariat is that in political discourse, the UN climate regime really feels like the center of climate politics. Politicians tend to refer to the Paris Agreement and international agreements when they talk about climate action that they want to implement domestically. And it really is like a strong reference point for climate politics. And I was just super interested in what the people that work year-round at the offices of such an agreement actually do. And yeah, that's what initially drew me there. And there's something exciting about getting so close to political action. And I think that's an excitement that you also see in the work of the staff members. I put up this cartoon by Tom Tolles just because I think it reflects very well what I've been talking about, this delayed human response and how kind of surreal it is. And it also tries to picture this weird phenomenon that which climate change is, as this abstract sun-like figure on the horizon. And a lot of social sciences and humanities spend a lot of research there spends time just thinking about what climate change is and what it means what climate change means for humans, and what creating this enhanced greenhouse effect tells us about ourselves. That's kind of the broader theoretical picture, I guess. Okay, back to the Secretariat. I wanted to show you a part of the building. It's good to start with the outer structure and the design. So this is these are the old parliamentary offices of the West German government, because Bonn used to be the capital of Germany. And there's actually no sign in front of this building that says Climate Secretariat, which I find kind of weird. It says United Nations on the front of the guardhouse because it's formerly a UN campus with a couple of organizations, but the UN Climate Change Secretariat is the biggest one on campus, and it doesn't say that anywhere on the building. And ironically, the sign for the German government is still up because it was deemed of historical value, so they weren't allowed to take it down. So it still says Deutsche Bundestag, German parliament, on this building. But what I think is interesting about it is it kind of amplifies the significance of this artwork with this thermometer on the side of the building. It's kind of the only sign that tells us that this is the climate building. And on specifically hot days in Bonn, you would always see a couple of staff members outside, like taking pictures of the thermometer. And this was one of those days. You see it's 41 degrees Celsius, which, wow, what's that in Fahrenheit? Does anyone want to Google that? I think it's 100 Fahrenheit. I think 40 Celsius is 100 Fahrenheit. So it's very warm for Germany. And so this kind of symbolizes what this building is about. But if we take it one step further, a thermometer is also conceptualizing or materializing the human idea to be able to understand our environment and even control it. Like it reminds us of an oven that we can tweak the temperature on. And that's kind of what humans have been doing with the climate, but we're not very good at tweaking it back, apparently. But that's kind of the idea here. And it's part of the irony also of, I think, the job of the Secretariat staff, because they're so invested in this mission and they work all year around on climate policy, but they're not formally in control of this political process, but they really feel like they should be in control or not that they should be in control, but that they own the process sort of, because while the delegates that come to the negotiations know the politics very well, they have their domestic duties back home in the ministries. So they're not like thinking about climate policy all year round like these staff members. And maybe just to tell you a bit about how the Secretariat is structured and how you can understand it. It's a workplace with about 400 staff members. So it's a very large Secretariat. And a good way to think about it is in comparison to a ministry. That it's kind of the bureaucratic administration that serves a parliament or some kind of political system where you have politicians. And the politicians there are the delegates that come to the negotiations. They have the political authority, and then decisions are made, and the ministry often needs to execute based on the decisions. And that's what the Secretariat does. But they also serve the meetings themselves in a way. And taking the ministry metaphor one step further, you could even think of the Secretariat as a government of climate change. And the different departments of the Secretariat, which are called programs, that these programs are kind of like individual ministries in a government. And it's kind of a better metaphor, because what I realized when I started working there and when I interned there first as part of my research, is that the departments are very, very siloed. You have a division on adaptation, a division on mitigation, on finance and technology, on the carbon markets. And while these people know each other, they don't know much what they're doing, and they like keeping these offices quite closed. So they're kind of like different line ministries in a government. And just to tell you a little bit about why I was there and in what capacity I was there, but I can talk about access stuff maybe more in the questions later. But I did an internship in the mitigation program, and then I worked in the adaptation program. And in between, I worked for a project that's hosted in the Secretariat, but isn't specifically part of the Secretariat. They coordinate development action. They coordinate development funding into climate action in the developing countries, and the offices are hosted there. So that was a very neat way to me to keep myself on site as an anthropologist and maintain my relationships with the staff there. But I was actually working not directly in the Secretariat at that point. Okay, so let's dive into the fun stuff. 2 pictures from a negotiation meeting. So these are consultations. They're called informal consultations, which sounds really boring in a way, or really dry. And the reality of the matter is that they are oftentimes very dry, especially when you see them for the first time, because it's such technical language that it doesn't really make sense when you first enter a negotiation room. You need to kind of follow the same issue for a couple of meetings and even for a couple of sessions to fully grasp what they're talking about. But so these are the negotiation meetings, and this is kind of the lowest tier of delegate meetings, but still the most kind of policy work goes on in these meetings. Like the nitty-gritty of the policy work is being discussed in these type of venues, the rooms of this size. But if you follow the negotiations through global media, you'll most of the time not see you won't be seeing these rooms. You'll be seeing huge plenaries where the delegates come together to open and close the whole session, which takes 2 weeks in time, as I'm sure you know. But this is where where stuff happens, and I think it's fun to see these 2 pictures side by side because they show us the 2 typical designs of a negotiation room. On the right, you have kind of the classroom setting where the delegates sit in lines and all face the same direction. And on the left, you have this kind of circular setting where they all see each other's faces. And well, it's most of the time it's a rectangle. It's not a circle, but so it's different formats, and it gives off slightly different vibes. But in my experience, the Secretariat doesn't really think about these vibes when they're scheduling different rooms. It's totally haphazard in what kind of design a negotiation lands. They're more thinking just about the size of the room, how many delegates can sit there. And to talk about the main elements in a negotiation, it's easier to focus on the picture to the right, because there you see the people that are sitting in the opposite direction and watching the delegates. That's the panel where you have the Secretariat staff and the chairpersons, which Joanna de Pledge is telling us about in her article. And under the UN climate regime, you have these two chair people, one elected from each side of the group of negotiators, one from the developing countryside and the other from the developed countryside. And this is, like Joanna was explaining to us, to minimize any bias that you could have, because a lot of the disputes, sadly, are across this divide, across the divide between the developing world and the developed countries. And just as a side note, because I want to be respectful, as an anthropologist, I'm not very invested in these markers, developing and developed, and I think they're kind of wrong terminology ethically. But I use them because these are the terms that the people in my field site and the delegates use themselves. We call these emic terms in anthropology. It's the terms that the people we are working with use. So yeah, you would have the chair up there, and on both sides you have Secretariat staff. And what's the Secretariat staff doing? Well, their basic responsibilities is booking the room and making sure that you have the room and that it functions technologically. You have the screen and the mic set. But then when you're at the table, your main responsibility is getting down in a Word document everything that the delegates are saying, which is really important because of the work that the chairpersons and the Secretariat need to do in between meetings. They need to have a very good documentation of what was said in the meeting. They also have this advisory role, which is mostly procedural, that if the chairpersons are unsure what happens next in the meeting, what step they should take, they can seek advice from the Secretariat. And there's a distinction between procedural advice and substantial advice, where you would be advising on the politics, like on the different options. And the Secretariat likes to talk like they don't really give that much political advice because they're not supposed to, but this is kind of a messy distinction. There's not a clear mark between what's procedural and what's political. So they definitely do give political advice, but they try to do it in a very impartial manner. More things about the room. You see these screens, and the screens are there because the negotiators are working with a draft text. That's basically what they're negotiating, a decision, a political decision. So nowadays, you use screens a lot. Before they had screens, the Secretariat would print out the draft text and distribute in the room, and they still do this most of the time, but delegates mostly negotiate by looking at these screens if they want to change something in the text. And on the left, in the rectangle setting, it's a bit more complicated. You see there are screens in the middle of the rectangle and then also in the corners. There's an interesting thing in the left picture too, sociologically. It's called a huddle, and it's something I know Jessica has seen a lot in her trips to the COP. It's a thing that happens, and I think the best way to explain it is that it's a meeting within the meeting. So you're having a meeting, and parties are negotiating, different countries are negotiating, and then suddenly a part of the room needs to discuss something, and then they group together like this to discuss a specific element in the text. And you see a lot of the other delegates are seated still, partly probably because they're not part of that group which is negotiating together. But you also have assistants of delegates that wouldn't stand up and walk into that circle, because you don't want to have too many people in the circle. So a delegate wouldn't take a junior delegate or a junior assistant with him, but just one person from each delegation would usually go. And it's of course supposed to be kind of this closed meeting in the meeting room, but very often you see Secretariat staff and the chairs walk towards these huddles and kind of listen in. And I've never seen anybody like shoo them away because, you know, they're choosing to have this meeting kind of out in the open. And it is kind of practical for the Secretariat to maybe hear what options are being discussed. It will make it easier for them to help drafting and help guide the meeting. But it's kind of it's a funny thing that happens. And sometimes when a group of delegates decides to huddle, another group that doesn't need to be discussing anything kind of awkwardly also stands up and huddles, just to be like huddling in contrast to the other group. It's a funny thing to look at when you're in the negotiations. Okay. Yeah, I think we can leave these pictures and look at this draft text. How exciting. So in the end, a negotiation is about text. It's about this legal text. And as you read in De Pledge's article, the power of the Secretariat is very tied to the creation of this text because it's the core of the negotiation. And the chairperson, which has been elected from the group of delegates to be this impartial facilitator, they tend to get permission to draft the initial text. And they also tend to get permission from the delegates to revise the text in between meetings if it's very clear what needs to be changed. And what Joanna De Pledge tells us also is that, and I've experienced this too, is that most of the time the Secretariat is doing the heavy lifting in this drafting. But well, we'll talk about that a bit later. Let's look at this text. It's the draft text for one part of Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. And this article has to do with market mechanisms. So any of you that might be specifically looking at this one in class or this sector of the regime might find this interesting. The reason I pulled it up is because it's the last part of the Paris Agreement that hasn't been fully negotiated. And this might come as a surprise for some people that the Paris Agreement is kind of open and still needs to be negotiated. But the reality is that the Paris Agreement is an agreement to do lots of things. And the countries agreed to do that, but you still need to keep negotiating what you actually meant by a lot of the things. And in Katowice in Poland at COP24, the delegates managed to finalize what they called the Paris Rulebook, and it's formally called the Paris Agreement Work Program, which details kind of what the Paris Agreement means technically. But this item was left out, this Article 6 about market mechanism, because it's very politically sensitive. The kind of elevator pitch about what the dispute is that a group of parties wants to kind of just copy paste the old mechanism from the Kyoto Protocol over onto the Paris Agreement. And another group of parties wants to tweak it a bit and make it better. They thought the Kyoto mechanism wasn't working very well and they want to make it a bit better. And then you have loads of small little disputes. And the interesting thing is the disputes with a draft text in a negotiation room can sometimes be about kind of something that doesn't feel like part of this issue. And that's why I picked the page on the right-hand side to show you too. So the left-hand side is the first page of this draft decision. And on the right-hand side, you have a page that's further down. And the thing is, these decisions are very different in length. Some decisions are only one page, but if you have very technical decisions, they can be huge. And this is an example of a very technical and very long decision text. And the thing on the right is kind of the reason why it hasn't been adopted. It's like the biggest dispute under this item, and it's not about mitigation, which carbon trading mechanisms are all about. It's about adaptation. It's about this tax on bilateral carbon credit transactions between nations, a tax that should go towards adaptation funding, to the adaptation fund. And under the Kyoto Protocol, they had this kind of tax on the general market when you're trading carbon credits into the market. But this specific article is just about bilateral trading, when two countries decide to sell emissions between themselves without entering the market. And they didn't have a tax there, but a group of countries wants this tax on this part of the carbon trading too, and another group really does not want it. So let's look at it. The reason we see it hasn't been concluded is because we see these option things, option A, B, C. On the left-hand side, you see no options, and that kind of signals that the parties, the countries, agree on they already kind of agree on the text on the left. You only see this bracket in the beginning that's telling you that it's still being negotiated. If there would be a bracketed sentence somewhere within the text on the left-hand side, that would signal that this is a sentence that not everybody agrees upon and still needs to be negotiated. But you have nothing like that, so it seems like the parties are pretty happy with the text on the left side. On the right side, you only have options, which means that everything is up for debate here. And under section 7, you have these 3 options, which represent 3 positions, 3 different stakes, and 3 different groups that want 3 different things. And most of the time what happens is in the initial draft made by the Secretariat and the chair, you'll have no options, you'll just have text. And then in the next negotiation meeting, a group will say, oh, we're not happy with this. We would like to make this, we would want to say this and that instead. And that's when the Secretariat in their computer creates this option B, or in this case, actually option C, because option B here is what I would call a bridging option. It's a middle ground option. And this option is made when you acknowledge that there's a dispute. The next step is very often to try to find middle ground. And the chairperson and Secretariat can try to get permission to find this middle ground. And this is where the skill and intelligence of the Secretariat of the issue often comes in. But they can also, they have other tricks too. They can also ask a party a country that maybe doesn't have a huge stake in option A or C to act as mediator. And this is especially done in very sensitive issues. And if you have a delegate that's very charismatic and isn't on either side, this can be a very clever choice to ask this specific delegation to lead the work on a bridging option. Very often, these disputes are about whether or not to put a specific element into the decision. And this is a clear example of that. Option A is kind of a new element. It's about putting a tax on something, and other people don't want this tax. So what you often get is you get a contrasting option that simply says no text. Option C, you get 2 brackets and no text. So it means that part of the delegates just don't want anything there. They don't want this section. The interesting thing about this part here is that we kind of have a no text option, although it doesn't say no text. So let me read option C. Parties participating in cooperative approaches are encouraged to provide adaptation financing to assist developing country parties that are particularly vulnerable. Okay, so at face value, this kind of looks like, oh, the people that support this option must want a tax. Like they want a statement saying that parties doing bilateral trading, the technical term for that is this cooperative approaches, should provide adaptation financing. But the key word here, and maybe some of you have already noticed it, is the word encouraged. if something is encouraged in international law, it doesn't really mean anything. Like there's no clear mandatory demand there to do something. So, okay, that's interesting. I kind of get carried away when we're looking at these texts. There's so many things to explain. I guess overall, what I want you to see here too is how technical it is and how far it is from the popular climate discourse that we're used to. And of course, this is a highly technical item, but still, I would say most of the decisions look something like this. You don't see your regular climate discourse. And at first, it's a bit disappointed if you're interested in climate change and you enter this venue. You're like, where am I? Like, what alien technical place have I found myself in? But then when you get the code that's going on, like that bilateral trading is called cooperative approaches, when you start picking up these codes, you understand the matter better. Okay, chairpersons and the Secretariat. So there's a lot to talk about here too. I think one of the important things to have in mind is something that Joanna mentions, and that's that there's a hierarchy of chairpersons. And highest up in that hierarchy, you have the president of the COP, which is an official from the host country, very often a minister of environment. And this person is technically a chairperson, and she's highest up in this hierarchy, but she'll never do any technical drafting most of the time. She's very much just a political actor, and she controls the opening and closing meetings of these big plenary meetings. So for an observer, it might look like this person doesn't do much because you only see them in these meetings, but actually a good president is doing so much work behind the scenes. They try to have oversight over all the negotiation items with their staff, because it's diplomatically hugely important that the COP in your country goes well and that they conclude as many items as possible. So behind the scenes, this chairperson is like a huge political actor, and program officers and team leaders, like lower tier staff members, will not be engaging with this person, but senior management of the Secretariat will have daily meetings with the presidency, talking about different options to push in under different items or issues that they're discussing. The chairpersons that Joanna is mostly talking about, and that I've been talking about in relation to these photos we were just looking at, they're the lowest higher, but they're doing a lot of work. In between, you have chairs over the different bodies of negotiations, which are kind of like speakers of the House in the parliamentary context. They're kind of supposed to be impartial actors, but they're definitely not, in essence, impartial. They're trying to maneuver things in certain directions. One of the important things to take from Joanna's article is this veil of legitimacy, which is very hard to explain. It's kind of an interesting thing sociologically, because in many ways it's unexplainable. It's just a function that works for the political process. The idea is that although the chairperson and the Secretariat are working together, that it's immensely important that as soon as the chairperson walks into the negotiation meeting with a text that he's going to propose or she is going to propose, or a proposal for the agenda or how to carry out the meeting, that the chairperson needs to take full responsibility of the politics of the matter. If a delegate raises an issue with something that was maybe actually proposed by a Secretariat staff member that's sitting by the side of the chair can't look at the Secretariat staff and say, please, can you explain this? Because then it shows that the Secretariat is actively taking part in the politics, which they by definition aren't doing. They don't have the political power formally. So it ruins the political drama and ruins the trust that you need to build in these kinds of meetings. So it's really important when it comes to the work of the staff, this impartiality that they need to embody and work based on. And I think I can add to De Pledge's article here a bit, because it doesn't really go far in discussing what impartiality means, but there are very important two sides to it. It's both about performing this impartiality and looking like you're impartial. And this sounds a bit like the Secretariat is hiding that they're actually biased, but that's not really the case. It's just important that they perform this just to have the trust of the meeting room. But it's equally important that functionally they also act impartially when they engage with the chairperson. So it's also functionally important. You can't only put on an impartiality drama, because when you're working on the draft text, for example, you need to create what they call a balanced draft, a draft that includes a balanced proportion of views from each group within the room. If you don't do this and bring in a draft that has maybe 10 ideas from one delegation and no ideas from the other, however you try to perform your impartiality, the delegates will just say this is a unbalanced, biased draft. And you hardly ever see this happen this drastically, because it would be a disaster. This in some respect is the job of the Secretariat when it does negotiation support, to ensure that what's brought into the meeting is not gonna like throw everything, like put everything on fire politically. Like it's important that they guide that what's brought into the meeting is balanced and fair, because they have so little time. They just have 2 weeks to make very big decisions. So if you just by ruining one meeting and bringing one bad draft, you kind of ruined the chance of getting a conclusion at that specific COP. It's that delicate most of the time. It's hugely important. Yeah, so I don't think I need to go maybe into these definitions. She explains it quite well in the article. We can talk about it later, but she's trying to distinguish between the power of the chairperson and the Secretariat by using political authority for the delegates, which is, I think, a very fair description. They have the political authority, and the chairperson has added political authority that's given to him from the delegates. And she talks about how you could kind of explain the Secretariat as having bureaucratic authority. And she references some authors that have done this, but she doesn't seem very convinced with this bureaucratic authority term. And I think her trouble with it is that the bureaucratic authority is always subordinate to the political authority, because the Secretariat gets mandates from the political. So it's not maybe, it doesn't explain much to say that they have bureaucratic authority. And she goes for talking more about how they have this slightly more vague thing, which she calls intellectual capital. They have some kind of knowledge that the chairperson needs to extract. And through the chairperson extracting this knowledge, the Secretariat can influence the negotiations. Okay, so influence. What I'm interested in, what power these people actually have. It's what De Pledge chooses to call, well, she calls it a couple of things. She uses this intellectual capital word, but she also talks about organizational energy, which I like a lot. But still it's a bit passive. So from an anthropological perspective, because I'm trying to reveal the actual influence and control that the staff thinks they have and think they might have, I like to work with some kind of power word. And I've been working with this word service power, which I would define as highly uncertain and very untraceable. So the staff definitely believes that they can influence and control the process to some extent, but it's very hard to know to what extent they do this. And it's very hard to trace whether how you drafted something or how you proposed an agenda or how you advised on a specific element, how much it actually contributes to the final outcome. And there's no way to fully trace this. So that's why I'm interested in just how they understand their power. And to me, it's clear that this is a power that emerges in the proximity to a political actor that has this kind of decision-making power. And there's an irony to this. There's an irony to being so invested year round in something and feel that you have so much knowledge about it. And oftentimes they feel like they know the issue better than the chairperson, which can be very knowledgeable about the issue, but you've spent your whole year just thinking about these couple of paragraphs. Of course, you feel like you kind of know better sometimes. But so it's kind of ironic because they don't control the political process in the end. They just have this potential to affect, and they have this strategic imagination and knowledge that the chairperson doesn't necessarily have. And so, in contrast, the irony of this power is that you also need to know how to detach from the process. And you see this most clearly when negotiations fail, when things don't go according to plan. Officers are miserable. They've been maybe not sleeping for 3 nights in a row, trying to draft something so that it works. And they need to keep faith. They need to believe that they can manage to inject an idea into the draft that will create this balance. But sometimes it doesn't happen. And they tend to, at least in the first hours after the failure, blame themselves. They think, what if I proposed this or drafted this a bit differently? Did I go too far with this? So there's a lot of emotions there and contradicting emotions. And senior staff are in my experience, better at kind of detaching and just like recognizing that in the end, we aren't in control of political decisions. We just do our best. But it's this untraceability of how you might have maybe been able to influence something that really bugs the staff, I think, understandably. Yeah, I'm doing fine on time, Jesse, right? I guess then maybe I'll tell you, like, just to give some texture to what I'm talking about, I'll tell you 2 kind of insights or snapshots from the negotiations and give you some insight into the tricks that the Secretariat has in their arsenal. You could speak of it as kind of a procedural arsenal. One interesting thing that I heard is from a pretty experienced officer, and I was asking her about, how you inject ideas into the text, and there's so many ways to do it, and it really depends on what kind of relationship you have with the chairperson. And she told me a story of a very politically sensitive negotiation, which had been going on for a couple of sessions and they'd never managed to conclude. And the Secretariat had done some scoping work politically and had come to the conclusion that there was a certain solution in sight. There was an element that they could put in the decision that they thought there was a consensus on, but the difficult thing was that it was very volatile, and one group of parties didn't want to talk about this element and wanted to be kind of against it, at least on the surface. So what they did is that they injected the idea into the structure of the draft. So they injected an idea into a subsection, into the title, and they didn't put this element into a paragraph. And what they saw happen in the negotiation room is that in the first and second negotiation meetings, when the delegates are seeing the draft for the first time, they tend to go straight to the paragraphs and want to throw out things that they don't want there or talk about things they want to add to it. But they don't look as much at the headlines if there's not interesting stuff below in the paragraphs. And this worked in this specific case, that this element got adopted because it was kind of in the structure of the draft text. And this staff member told me that she's done this again, that when something is very sensitive, you try to inject it in a very subtle way into the draft, because when you're maybe in your third or fourth negotiation meeting, it's very hard for the delegates to start picking at the structure of the draft. That's something you should have mentioned in the first meetings, but they tend not to mention. So this is a small trick I noticed. And it's super interesting because it sounds rather boring, like the structure of the draft text, but becomes so significant. Another side, which doesn't have to do with the draft text and more about, the atmosphere of negotiations, is that staff members use this phrase, reading the room. Everybody uses this. You hear it from people, from officers within all programs. They talk about how they're bad at reading the room, or how it took them such a long time to get good at reading the room. And so I was really interested in getting to understand better what this actually means. And it means a lot of things, but basically it's having a sense for the political atmosphere in the room. And seasoned staff members are very good at, just in the first meeting or even in the pre-sessional meetings, to get just kind of a feeling whether the negotiators are excited to conclude the matter. So this is part of it, but it's also about specific things you need to read into. And I think the example I wanted to bring forth is silence. So a very senior delegate told me that one of the last things he figured he had to do in these meetings when he's sitting at the panel table is to not only listen to the delegates, but map out which delegates who are not speaking. And sometimes it's not a big deal. Not every delegate can speak in a meeting, and they tend to negotiate in groups. So most of the silent delegates are just silent because another delegate is actually speaking, like bringing forth their position. They don't have to speak. But some of the delegates may be silent, and it may be more like an abnormality. One of the things this person told me is that you have certain key countries that tend to always speak, especially when you have very disputed issues. So big actors like the EU, China, the US, these are countries that tend to speak in negotiations. And this person always checks if this person didn't speak. And if there's a weird silence from a delegate, it can mean a number of things. It can mean that the delegate is disappointed with the draft, like utterly disappointed. And sometimes when the delegates are disappointed, they're in a politically twisted position, and they maybe don't want to say out loud that they're disappointed and want to just tell the chair in private afterwards. So you need to pick up on this. But it can also mean that the delegate is confused, because diplomatically, these are very sensitive settings, and a lot of delegates aren't necessarily comfortable with raising their hand and saying, I don't understand what's going on here. So sometimes delegates get confused, and some delegations, even culturally, it's a taboo to open up that you don't understand something. So in those cases, the Secretariat needs to be sensitive to maybe walk to them afterwards and strike a conversation and try to figure out what's the matter, and maybe pick up on whether they're confused with a paragraph, and then talk them through it. And this is really delicate, because they can't ask directly, because then they sound like they're undermining the delegate and their knowledge. So it's a delicate matter that they get better and better at doing. And just the simple thing of walking around the room after the meeting and talking to the delegates is really difficult for the Secretariat. And I know a lot of the younger staff is terrified of this moment. So not the actual meeting, but the moment after the meeting, when people kind of relax and have easy conversation with each other. And it's really important for the staff to be able to talk with the negotiators. But young staff tend to be scared to do this because it looks like you're biased, like you're making friends with one side rather than the other. So it's so cool to watch the seasoned officers, how they're skilled in just like hovering through the crowd after a meeting and striking just short, simple conversations, kind of just testing the pulse on each delegate. It's a very good example of how this is an embodied skill to be a staff member. Okay, now I think we should go into discussions. I had this final slide about my research. It's something I can talk about in the discussions, but one of my struggles after my fieldwork was that I had a hard time finding where climate change actually was in my data, because it hardly ever gets mentioned in the way I was used to seeing climate change mentioned before I entered this bureaucratic venue. And I had to kind of learn to ask the question, what do climate politics look like? Because climate politics are very complicated, and they don't necessarily look like what they look like in the media or when you see activists speaking about stuff. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I'm slightly over time. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to discussing more with you guys.
Wonderful, Magnus. That was so interesting. Thank you. So I'm going to give my comments, and they're very, very organized. Just kidding. And so I'll try to only talk for a couple of minutes, just about some of the things I was thinking about as a way of opening up the conversation with the class. Students, when we're discussing, if you're comfortable or if you want to, please do turn on your camera. Just is a little easier to converse with faces rather than squares. Of course, this is not compulsory. So I think this was really interesting. I think the students are going to be interested in this in several levels, and this will come out in the questions. But one of the really sort of insider pieces is what the sort of work looks like. Most of the students here are international studies students, and a lot of them go to work for the US government or for UN, other IGOs. And so getting sort of a glimpse at what this looks like at the level of actually being an employee is really valuable. Also, I really liked, so I guess the first point, and I think I have 4 or 5 general themes I was thinking about. One is about space and rooms and the venue, and you know I've thought about this before, but looking at your pictures, I found myself trying to guess which meetings they were. I know the previous one we were just looking at was Madrid, but the smaller meeting rooms, I think one of them was Poland, and I think that because of the design of the heaters and the chairs, that's Madrid. Yeah, so I think it's Poland on the left. On the right, I don't really know, but I think it's Bonn. But I just guessed that because is it right? That water bottle is.
Yeah, it's Bonn. It's the right one is Bonn.
Yes.
I actually don't. I think it's Madrid to the left, actually, not Poland. But it's also similar. These tent structures, they're always the same. But I think even if you look at the computer, doesn't it say 25 on the computer screen where the scarf is on the keyboard?
Oh, see, and so there are these little, and I wasn't in a lot of the tent space at Madrid last winter, where I think I caught COVID. I was sick. That was the last time I was sick because that was the last time I was allowed to travel. I went to Portugal once after. Anyway, so I wasn't allowed into the tent spaces very much in Madrid. Those meetings were supposed to be in Chile because it's just finishing up Article 6. In Madrid, the meetings ended up being longer than any other COP because of these very sensitive final negotiations that still haven't closed up. And Magnus, in his role, which was very different, I was an institutional observer on IU's badge. He had a Secretariat badge, which is just like VIP everywhere you want to go. And so perhaps that's why I didn't get to hang out in those tents very much. I really like the stuff about huddles. As you all know, I cut my teeth at negotiations at the Antarctic Treaty meetings, which I still attend. And at the beginning of my time at those meetings, I was with an environmental NGO, and we just went up to huddles, just like Magnus said. You sort of aren't kicked out of huddles. You sort of know if you're supposed to be there, and then you can just act like you're supposed to be there and listen. And those were very frank conversations where there's a lot of formal politeness when you're actually talking into a microphone. When you get in a huddle like that, which is like so COVID-y, really a lot of the speech drops off. It's very blunt and really fun to be in. Now I attend the Antarctic Treaty meetings on the US delegation, and I'm like a bottom feeder of the US delegation. And so I've had to be told over and over to mind my minimal place there. And so I can't go to huddles without permission from higher up in my delegation, partly because I'm wearing a badge not from an NGO, an environmental group, which is sort of meant to be annoying, but not very powerful, but have a badge of the United States of America. And if I'm standing there in the huddle, that has sort of a valence that I'm participating in the negotiations, not sort of just listening like an anthropologist. So the anonymous geographic spaces, and this is also the big secret of my research, that I get to travel to all these interesting places all over the world. And I'm really in these dark windowless rooms all the time. And they're just the tiny little emblems that they change from year to year to sort of signify where you are. These sort of blank spaces where this really important stuff happens. So it's not really a question, but I thought about that. But the geography of the place matters. And Magnus noted that the Secretariat's just trying to fit bodies in the room. But the geographic space of the meeting rooms really matter, and the function of the rooms as well. So if there have been some of the COPs, like in Paris, there were sound issues, and also in Madrid, which was hastily organized, there were sound issues. So you would have the room, but the room, we saw in a different slide, you see all the little rooms, but you're actually in a giant, huge room, which about 6 weeks later became a field hospital for COVID. And so the murmur of all of the other side meetings and side events happening really made it difficult to communicate. And sometimes they would solve that by you would have to wear your headphones in the meeting space so that people could hear each other in the rooms. And these sorts of technical issues affect these sort of subtle. It's almost the ambience of the anonymous space. Only stops being anonymous when it doesn't work as planned. Magnus talked about the government of climate change, which I think is super interesting, and that the government is about these staff people, but also about the process. And so that makes me think about the Paris Agreement generally. And when we read the Paris Agreement, which many of these students will end up in my delegation class in the fall, and they'll end up in Edinburgh at the COP next fall. And that's the class where we go article by article through the Paris Agreement. But really, when you actually read the Paris Agreement, what's really striking about it is how little is binding, how little is actually legally binding, and how much of the agreement itself is an agreement about communication and process. A lot of what is binding is information sharing. So the governments are obliged, and even then without any real repercussion, but are obliged to share information about what they intend to do and sort of the outcomes of what they have done. And so that it really is process all the way up and down, that it is about sort of meeting, sharing, talking, communicating, makes me wonder how much it seems like a lot of the form of the Secretariat, a lot of the form of the government of climate change has made it into the form of the international agreement as well. I loved seeing the draft text, and that was really interesting to think about and look, and sort of watching over the course of the negotiations every November, December, watching the brackets proliferate and diminish is one of the sort of exciting things about climate negotiations or policy negotiations in general. the question I have about that is whose eyes are on the text. Sometimes these are very open. Sometimes observers like IU are getting their eyes onto the text, and sometimes it really there are sort of points of constraint where it's the Secretariat and maybe only a couple of parties who are really at odds, trying to work out a clause or a piece to get it through. So who gets to see the text? And then who gets to change it? Often it's lower and mid-level negotiators who are lawyers. This is the part where you need lawyerly skill. I remember in a documentary that I watched about Copenhagen, you actually see President Obama and Secretary Clinton line editing draft text, which is so rare because often this is very, it's not an upper level thing to do, but to have that level of power with that level of detail was surprising because it was a bit of a mismatch, because it's usually these small rooms here where that line editing is happening, and then it's approved. It of course goes through levels of review outside of the room, but the wordsmithing is in that huddle there. Okay, then the material about the chairperson and secretariat, this work of impartiality, this idea of trust and balance in the text, really important. And so I guess maybe I was still thinking about lawyers there because I was wondering about the education and training, what the skill sets are of these secretariat employees, these junior ones walking the floor afterwards. So what's their knowledge base that they're operating from? Of course, a lot of this is picked up on the job, but where are they coming from? Are they all lawyers? I don't think they are, but who are they? And then the final little point I wanted to make is about the service power, which I really like, Magnus. So of this notion of being proximal, but also detached from power, political power in particular, and then having the power of knowing the institutional options, knowing what process options, you use the word inject, can be injected, or sort of ways to work on the text that can open up negotiations or speed them along. I think that is sort of a piece of service power. The question I have outstanding about that is, what is the role of service? So I'm getting the power, but I'm wondering a little bit what they're civil servants to be sure, but what is their sort of gesture of service or performance of service that's going along with this sort of humble, understated, but really apparent power. So those are just my big comments. I don't know, Magnus, if you want to address a couple of those, or if you want to collect questions from the students. We can. What do you think? So Magnus, do you want to respond to that a little bit, or do you want to start taking questions? You're muted. I'll unmute you. I'll ask you to unmute.
Okay, so you okay, great. If we have time, I can just do a really quick response and then we can open up.
Sounds good.
It's interesting to hear that a lot of you might be going into jobs like this, or at least the students of this program have been going to these kinds of jobs. So if you have questions just like about the job, I'm happy to answer those. I guess on the huddles, one thing I maybe didn't mention is they tend to happen in the last meeting or second to last negotiation meeting, because in the first meetings, when you have lots of other meetings to keep negotiating, you would just have these small meetings outside the room afterwards. So there's also a drama to it because it happens oftentimes towards the end of a negotiation. Yeah, maybe I'll speak a little bit towards the form and process point you made, Jesse. And thank you for all the points. It's really interesting and good to get a reflection on what I'm thinking about. It definitely is mostly about processes, these international agreements, and it says so kind of in the name of the convention. It's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's about a framework. They're building an infrastructure of policy for domestic policymakers to refer to. And because nation states are sovereign, you can't make very good devices that make it mandatory to do this and that, because if a nation state doesn't want to do something, they just decide they don't want to. But so these things work best if there's other types of political pressure and economic pressures applied to these guidelines. But it's very much about form. And maybe then I'll jump just into the lawyer point, which I found maybe most interesting, because it's one of the things that's troubled me in my research. When I explain it to people, people very often go into like questions about how legalistic it is, and it is definitely legal work, but it doesn't really feel like legal work. Well, I'm not a lawyer. I've never done legal work, but most of the staff aren't lawyers either, and most of the staff have governmental backgrounds or some kind of sectoral education. A lot of agricultural degrees in the Climate Secretariat, but you definitely also get people with law degrees or law experience. And, you know, the work is legalistic, but I think the most interesting thing I could add is, and this is maybe something that people generally don't know if you haven't just been a delegate, that the draft text, when it's finished, it's sent to the Secretariat legal team, and there's a specific legal department that reads over the text, and they most of the time do lots of edits. But these edits are always framed as procedural to the delegates, and they get an email showing what was changed, and they maybe get an explanation, a legal explanation why it needs to be phrased in this and that way. So there is a specific legal process to polish the text so it's right legally. But then again, staff members and teams tend to pick up what's correct legal language. So the teams also become quite good at structuring sentences in the right way. And just with any discourse, as soon as you get fully immersed in it, it isn't as complicated as it looks, I think. Yeah, and finally, with the service power thing, I'm happy you like the concept. The service side kind of just comes from them being civil servants, like you said. And the idea is that in the end, what they do is service, and that's kind of literally correct. They do only offer things to the political realm, and they can always reject them. So all their work can be framed as a service. They're just offering things, but most of the times these things are taken on board because they're intelligent and clever and nice ways to tweak a draft text. One little detail, for example, which surprised me, I'm not sure all Secretariat teams do this, but I know a couple of them do because I've heard them talk about it. They actually make draft options before the COP. So the Secretariat can have lots of draft options and draft texts, and they even categorize them based on scenarios. If they go in this direction and want a very limitedly progressive decision, they'll want the text that looks a little bit like this. If they go in like the best case scenario, take a huge leap under the issue, it might look something like this. And I mean, they're often doing this stuff overnight, and it's kind of impossible to do it without having prepared some sentences and stuff. And De Pledge has a nice moment when she talks about that in her article, that a delegate she interviewed or a staff member she interviewed that used to be a delegate talks about how they never understood how the chairperson managed to produce these drafts overnight. Yeah, I think that's about it, Jesse. Thanks for the comments. That's really helpful. But I think we can open it up for questions.
Terrific. So if you would like to ask a question, Sydney put something in the chat. Maybe the procedure will be, you can mark like with an exclamation point that you'd like to be called on like that, and we'll call on you. Sydney, do you want to ask the first question? And those of you who have questions, you can put a note in the chat so that we can call on you.
Oh, okay. Well, mine was just more like wondering how many times like words like encouraged or like vague words sort of like that didn't make mandatory action. Like Dr. O'Reilly said, shall means mandatory. But like how many times that is in the Paris Agreement? Like how many times do they actually use the word shall versus other words that are more vague, like encouraged, or I don't know another example, or should, I guess.
Yeah. So that's a really, really good question. And it would be really interesting to go through the agreements and kind of map this out. That would be an interesting task, maybe something for a linguistic anthropologist. But so it's a lot about these action verbs. I think it's called modal verbs, or, well, I'm not sure what it's called. It's a verb at least. And it ends up being a lot about the mode of what's being requested or demanded. And so if you look at the Paris Agreement, for example, because it's kind of the initial framing agreement for lots of other decisions that are going to be made in the COPs to follow, and you need this broad consensus on this new frame, a lot of it is vaguely phrased. Because if you would try to phrase it in a more specific manner, you would never reach this consensus, because the countries actually had loads of disagreements underneath each sentence in the Paris Agreement. You can kind of think about it like that. So my hypothesis, if somebody would go and map this out, would be that these kinds of words will diminish as you go further down the decision line and get more technical. And that's why, for example, in the draft text we looked at, which is a pretty technical draft text, it kind of shines out when you see encouraged, because it means absolutely nothing in a technical text like this. So it's an interesting question, because delegates probably have kind of a sense also how technical their decision text should look like. So yeah, that's nice. And it's such a weird world. This should and shall that Jesse mentions in the chat too. Shall is when a thing is mandatory, in sense, like it's the closest you get to something being mandatory. And but in the end, it's just kind of an unwritten agreement between the countries that this word means that we all agree that this is like really important. And I guess it kind of means that if you don't do the thing behind the shall, you are like, you'll need to answer for it, and you'll need to explain yourself, while you won't need to explain yourself as much if you don't go and do something with a should in front. So there's a slight difference in level between should and shall. Shall is like very close to mandatory, should is closer to encouraged. Fun, fun, fun.
Yeah, I think we counted it before. I think there might only be 4 shells in the Paris Agreement. All right, Ben and then Leo.
Yeah, hi, Magnus. Thanks for, it was a really interesting talk. I really appreciated it. I too was, like Jesse, I was fascinated by the huddles. I think that those seem like very just interesting and ethnographically rich moments during these conventions and meetings. So I had a couple of questions about the huddles, and then one question for just these events in general. With the huddles, sort of, can you talk a bit about, sort of, Jesse was alluding to this, but kind of negotiating your presence there as a researcher rather than necessarily a participant. Thinking about that just from an ethnographic standpoint, you're kind of participant observing, but you're not participating as in like giving contributions, but maybe you're still seen as a participant observer, but just sort of talking about navigating that role as a researcher in that scenario. And then the second question I had about huddles is, can you talk a bit about, I guess, power dynamics and who can talk and when as it relates to factors such as gender or age or seniority, kind of if someone is recognized as like, oh, they're really important, they've been here for a while, so they can talk more so than other people. You just kind of, how do you negotiate that, both in a huddle or maybe non-huddle context? And then the third question I have is if you could talk a bit about.
You muted yourself.
Oh, sorry, I accidentally clicked it. But
It was the third question.
Yeah, it's sort of and the after hours portions of these events, kind of what those, I guess, relationships look like as far as I don't know, is that idea of striving for impartiality ever dropped, or sort of when you go to this event, you are always impartial the whole time you're there, like as a chairperson or secretariat, and then when you leave, like, go back to, you take that off. I know you said it's not a veil of impartiality, it's actually like striving for it, but I guess talking about what that looks like outside the tent context, if you have that kind of data.
Yeah. Wow. Those are great questions. Would we like to collect questions, or should I go one by one? I'm just wondering now whether we should collect a couple and I go through them, or what do you think?
Let's get Leo's too, and then you can respond and we'll see if more come along.
Okay, cool.
Okay. My question's kind of along the same lines then, in the huddles and then outside of them in general, but I know the article that we read mentioned language barriers influencing the dynamics and the kind of power dynamics of like who gets to speak and their command over the process. But I was just wondering if you could speak more to, if you've seen those have significant influences, or maybe if there's like ways to overcome those.
Great. Wonderful questions. Thank you guys. Okay. So first, the huddle one. I thought it was interesting to listen to Jessica talk about kind of how she had to negotiate for herself where she could position herself at the Arctic Council, because it's kind of similar. You need to know what your role is, and it's often very unclear how far you can go. I've been on a Secretariat badge, like was mentioned, and those are badges that make you feel like you can kind of do anything you want. But still, I remember because I'm very junior and even have this like weird place of researcher. So I'm definitely like bottom tier Secretariat staff, and I don't know all the codes. So I was pretty cautious in doing anything in meetings, because in these environments, there are always all these unwritten rules that you definitely don't want to break. So I remember going close to huddles just because I saw the officers next to me were doing it. But I definitely was afraid of doing things like that on my own. And then I've also gone to a COP on what's called the Party Overflow Badge. And I don't know if it's big in like big delegations like the US delegation. I think it's more of a thing in smaller countries, because the Secretariat gives each delegation like 50 badges if they want. But the Icelandic delegation is like at most 10 people at a time. That's the complete max. So they tend to give out these Party Overflow badges. So NGO officials can get them, and they have the same color as a delegate badge, but it says Party Overflows. But when I had that badge, I was kind of scared of what I was doing in meetings, because I was scared that it would be interpreted as I was an Icelandic delegate. So yeah, it really relies on how you sense your own status in the meeting. But maybe one more thing on huddles, because it's gaining a lot of attention, maybe because it's quite tangible in a pretty abstract world. So maybe to push back at that message, these are just, individual moments that sometimes happen towards the end of a negotiation. I would rather emphasize that most of the negotiating happens outside of the room. Heads of delegations meet before the session start. Specific delegations talk extensively about the decision in closed meetings within their group. So a lot of labor around the draft text and about the positions and the negotiating happens informally, because it's just sociologically and politically much easier. It's such a risk to have an open argument at the table in a negotiation, that most of the delegates don't want to have to dispute something out in the open with the observers in the room and everything. So a perfect scenario for the delegations is that they have kind of agreed outside of the room and just come into it to express their views and then agree on the text, which I would say is kind of the problematic part ethnographically, trying to observe these negotiations, that there are a lot of black boxes that you can't get into. But I would personally be very interested, for example, to try to be on a delegation and see what happens in delegation meetings. That's kind of data that I haven't acquired, but there are anthropologists that have been on delegation badges and actually sat in those meetings, and that's a different perspective on the political process. Where am I? Power dynamics. Power dynamics in terms of gender and age and such. That's a really good question, and because they're definitely there. But what's so interesting, especially ethnographically here, is that they are really relative based on who's the chairperson, who are the chairpersons, and who the staff is too. So the example I know best is from my own fieldwork. The team that I worked most closely with was an only women team. And they had a chairperson, which was an older male. And they had trouble engaging with this person, which wasn't fully respectful with them. And I would say, without having lots of empirical comparison data, that it was quite obvious that there was a gendered power dynamic there. There's also a weird thing that happens with some chairpersons, because it's so sensitive what kind of relationship you cultivate with the Secretariat and how it looks, that especially on politically volatile issues, which this issue I worked on was definitely, the chairperson sometimes starts, I saw it with this person and I saw it with other chair people too, they start to openly kind of negate the Secretariat in meetings and kind of perform that they're not with them. So how this happened was that he would sometimes kind of nag about that the PowerPoint wasn't working or they weren't quick enough with this and that. And part of it was maybe gender dynamics, I'm sure, but I think because it was a very sensitive issue and they were trying to push some serious injections into this draft text, I think he was also trying to perform that he wasn't the part of their team, that he was kind of independent. All to say, I think it really depends on chair people. And a big part of the Secretariat's job is also to cultivate a good relationship with them. And they might have also, I'll stop there. But it's a really interesting question about the power dynamics, but there's no easy answer. Okay, and the after hours question is great. I don't even know what to answer because my first effective reaction is kind of disappointment that the after-hour data that I was hoping to get as an anthropologist wasn't as rich as I kind of imagined it would be. Staff are like, usually staff is pretty heavily invested in climate change and climate action, but I would say generally they're not very interested in discussing this outside of work. And I think there are a couple of reasons. It's their work. So I think emotionally they're often just drained from, although they're not talking a lot about climate change, they think about their work through the prism of climate change. So they maybe just don't want to talk about it after work. And then it's this irony that they don't really control the process and they're not supposed to be political actors. So there's a lot of frustration around their personal political opinions. And I think younger staff are much more likely to want to discuss this with you, and they tend to be disappointed often. They thought the Secretariat work would be a bit different and maybe more activist-like, but it really isn't. Although you can affect the process, there's no clear way to do that, and the process is very slow. So senior staff tend to just don't want to talk about it, because I think it's emotionally painful for them to kind of open their hearts about what they think about climate action and what they would like to see when they have such an ambiguous understanding of what their role actually is. So I kind of imagined, I think in line with the question, the great question you gave me, that after hours they would kind of open up a lot and want to talk about things, but that wasn't really the case. Then, of course, you also have a number of staff that don't care about climate change specifically. They just got this UN job and they're happy with it.
Great.
Any more questions at this point?
Yep, there are a couple more. This reminds me though, last year, the IU delegation, the students met with the United States delegation, and they had this incredibly, surprisingly frank conversation, because I don't know if they were just fatigued from being diplomats for Trump's America, but they actually went on a really long tangent about how much they care about climate change, how this informs the work that they're doing, and they wouldn't be participating in that, without, of course, they're carefully trained and they didn't undermine any of American leadership. But at the same time, I actually was quite surprised, because I think what you're describing is quite typical. But I think the US negotiators have had a frustrating few years. So Sydney and Maria have questions.
Okay, mine sort of goes back to like the technical language that is used in the the negotiations with the secretariats and chairpersons. So from like an anthropological standpoint, does it really like marginalize delegates or chairpersons who may like come from a different, or who learned English as their second language, or just have like, and then does it like completely eliminate groups like Indigenous peoples, or like getting those perspectives into the Paris Agreement or into any climate negotiation, and sort of takes this whole like Western science perspective in solving climate change? Is that sort of how we see like these agreements going, where like the Western scientific knowledge or Western ways of knowing sort of dominate these negotiations simply because it's the technical language that is used? And I'm also wondering if there's like support or like translators that sort of help people to like understand this technical language and incorporate their language into it, or if it's just all sort of just technical language. If you don't know it, you don't know it, and you're sort of left out.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And that's a really interesting question about whether this work language affects the political dynamics. I don't have a clear answer, but I'm sure they do. I mean, I'm sure it's in the benefit of native speakers that the process is in English. And it's definitely a requirement for any delegate that's seriously going to work on text that they are very good in English. So a person that doesn't speak good English would probably not be picked by their government to do this. I think most countries in the world have officials in their ministries that are very fluent in English, so they can do the job. But I'm sure it benefits the people that are native speakers. I remember moments in negotiations where there's a clear, like, lost in translation kind of deal with the dispute. Like, especially I feel I've seen like younger delegates from big countries that are non-native speakers maybe take a hard stance based on their understanding of a word. And it's kind of awkward that it isn't fully correct. And it's, of course, that's humiliating, whether the delegate realizes it or not. And a lot of these negotiations are about status and being able to present yourself. So making mistakes with the language can impact how the delegates feel. So yeah, I think the short answer is probably yes, that it definitely matters, but it's hard to answer specifically how much and in which cases. I think Joanna in her article answers it a bit. She, I think, mentions it and talks about how the UN is supposed to work on these different languages so that people, to maximize the possibility that the delegates have at least one of these languages under their good control to understand the draft text. But for example, in these nitty-gritty negotiations, you don't get the translation. You're just working in English. The document is only translated when it's on a pretty when it's further down in the negotiation process. Then it would be interesting to know whether some delegations actually have translation services of their own. Like, I could imagine that there would be some staff that the delegates can reach out to in big delegations, like the Chinese delegation might have like a translator that can help delegates in between meetings if they have some questions about specific words and stuff. Yeah, that's my answer. Thanks for the question, Sydney.
Okay, so I was the next question. I was wondering also about communication, or not necessarily the words themselves, but like communication styles. So as someone, like, I had lived in China, and one of the biggest hurdles for me personally was the differences in communication styles. In the United States, we're very direct, we're very blunt, and we have that direct communication style, versus in China and a lot of Asian countries, they won't ever tell you no, or they'll, say, oh, maybe this is something that we could do. Is there a certain overarching communication style that is adopted in these meetings, or is that like a barrier that people have to work through in addition to the language barrier itself?
Wow, that's a great question. Not to my knowledge that there's like that they've been like, not to my knowledge that there have been like developed specific ways to speak together, but I think they organically probably emerge like kind of shortcuts in communication. Yeah, it's a good question, comparing like cultures that are more direct than those that are less direct and speak maybe more sub rosa about things. My guess would be that both sides kind of know that the other one has a specific culture and they kind of play into that. I would guess that the Chinese delegation knows that maybe when they're talking to the US delegation, they can't read the same signals that they would send other Chinese speakers. So I'm sure there's lots of just embodied knowledge about how you can communicate between countries. But then again, I think what happens is in the negotiation room, you need to be very clear and talk in very simple terms about what your view is. I guess that's a way to mitigate this problem of cultural difference, because it's often about nuance. So if you take the nuance away and just try to be clear about your view, it's more likely you won't be misunderstood. One interesting note is because you often can't speak your mind very directly in a meeting like this, and the US delegation wouldn't do it either, although they are maybe more direct culturally. For example, if you don't like something in a draft, you hardly ever hear a delegate say, I don't like this. They don't say, oh, paragraph 39, I don't like this paragraph. Could we have a different one? Or they also very seldom say, oh, I completely disagree with the delegate from Indonesia or something like this. They most of the times use very subtle signaling and much softer words. And I think they're all used to this. And one word that's interesting to listen for, because it seems to be code that goes across all delegations, that if you don't like something in a text, you use the word confused. So a delegate will say, oh, thank you, respectful delegate from Indonesia. I've been looking at paragraph 34.22, and I'm a bit confused with the wording there. What do we actually mean when we say? And then they present their problem with the text as kind of a confusion. And then the other delegate, if he wants to speak for the paragraph, will speak in a mode that they're clarifying a confusion. And then if they manage to, make the other delegate kind of like it more, the matter will be resolved. But more likely they just bounce back with these different confusions they have with the text. So if you ever sit in a negotiation, try to look for when they say they're confused and they're actually disagreeing.
I really like that. There are all these little diplomatic techniques and skills that I see delegates using. There's one issue in Antarctica that the US opposes, bioprospecting, regulation of bioprospecting, and every other party wants to regulate it. And so this is one of the moments where you may see direct conflict. So it's one of my favorite moments. But typically, the US sort of lets everyone air their views, and then the head of the delegation does what I call the hammer. But it's this very polite, gentle, but closes conversation. Once that person was distracted by another matter, so was talking to someone behind him, and you could see the chairperson get really nervous because the US hadn't come in, and the rest of the table had negotiated the set of regulations that and the chair knew the US wasn't amenable to it, but Evan was off having this other conversation, and it was really I was like, should I kick him under the table? Like, I mean, I kind of want it to be regulated, but he and so did the chair. So that moment where the flow of diplomacy was interrupted for a moment, and the chair actually said something like, so I think we're all in agreement, and then the US was like, vroom. It's kind of fun to watch, but again, you have to watch these over time in order to even get some of the subtlety of communication. And it is this odd, I mean, first, the US can just try to be a little more British to tone down our gregarious directness that just comes across as impolite. But also people from the US strategically deploy this sort of frankness in order to make their position known. So it's pretty interesting to see. Any other questions? I don't have any more on the chat.
Can I talk to something you just mentioned, Jessica? One of the, it connects with what I was talking about when I was talking about reading the room earlier. And the most important skill when it comes to reading the room is being able to distinguish between a position taken and the interest of the party. Because at first you would think that the position taken is always the interest of the party. And I think I have two examples of how this is not always the case. And the chairperson might not pick up on it. And that's where the knowledge of the Secretariat and what has gone on in these negotiations in previous sessions can come in handy if they notice, oh, this is not their sincere position. So the simple exception is probably that some delegations, and I'm not going to go into which ones, but I've had staff members tell me that they know certain delegations work in certain ways. And some delegations tend to never start with their sincere position, which is probably pretty good negotiation technique. They always go a bit to the extreme. And so, you know, when you hear their position, they actually don't expect this to happen. They're just pushing the envelope of the political imagination of the room into a direction so it will be more agreeable to their actual position, which is a little bit less extreme. So this is a very important dynamic to have when you're reading the room and reading what the delegates are saying. Another and more frustrating exception from this, or example of where the interest doesn't lie with the position, is when delegations block items or block negotiations. And when I say block, they raise an issue with something in the text because they actually don't want the negotiations to conclude. So their actual interest is just not concluding the negotiations on these items. Often these are big parties that just don't want any progress under this branch of the regime. So they'll just pick something in the draft text and make issue with it. And a good chairperson and a good secretariat staff will notice, okay, this is not actually something they disagree with. They actually disagree with the whole thing, and they're just wasting our time. But it's very frustrating because you don't really know whether this is happening or not, but sometimes it's just obvious. And the added complexity to situations like this is that sometimes not concluding the item isn't even their political interest. So sometimes a delegation might want an item to conclude in sincerity, but they block it to create a trade-off for another negotiation meeting that's happening somewhere else on another issue. So maybe the EU delegation figures out that they're not getting what they want in negotiation A and they have nothing to offer. So they strategize, okay, let's create an issue under negotiation B, and then we can maybe have a trade-off and say, we give you an agreement here where they have they've pretended that they don't like the text, but they actually are maybe just okay with it. And then they offer it as a trade-off. And for a secretariat staff and the chairperson, this is so frustrating because you're invested actually in the issue, but there's a person there's a delegation hijacking the discussion because of another issue. And the frustrating thing is sometimes you never know for sure that this is happening. So you need to sincerely listen to what's being raised in the room, but maybe there's no sincerity behind it. So this is just something I wanted to tell because I think it's a really important aspect of what the Secretariat needs to do, and it connected to this position taking that Jessica was talking about.
That's super interesting. I could talk about this all day. And maybe my last question will be about if you have any sense about the new rising US administration. I'll give my view is so the delegation from the United States has really shrunk in size. under President Trump. Because for various reasons, mostly because the administration doesn't care about climate change, nor does it want to be seen as supportive of international governance of almost any sort. And that has really limited a lot of US techniques, some of which Magnus is talking about right now, in their ability even to have enough people to cover all these little meetings and sub-meetings and enact all these little strategies that make the United States a powerful negotiator. So we still have Article 6 open, unless I'm confused about something. My sense, it probably was good not to have the COP this year as sort of from thinking from the US perspective, to have to wait a year and have this more favorable administration. I'm wondering, do you have any sense, or, and I know you have to be careful about what you talk about, but do you have any sense in how a Biden administration with John Kerry, who's a longstanding sort of friend of the UNFCCC, as the climate czar, how that might nudge things forward, or does it not really matter? What's your sense on that?
Yeah, good question. I think it's hugely important that the US is coming back into the regime. It's just such a big actor, and it doesn't really, it's a global issue. You need all the big emitters together. And I think it would have been really, really bad if the US would have been out of the agreement for the next 4 years. So I think politically, diplomatically, it's very important that they're going back in just to make good global agreements that actually work, because any agreement not with the US is such a big emitter just doesn't mean that much. So just on that basic level, it's so important. Maybe on the bureaucratic level, it's kind of interesting how professional these settings are, in the sense that you might imagine that there would have been some antagonism towards the US delegation after the administration announced that they were going to step out of the agreement. But you know, the people on the delegations are professionals, and their work is just to maintain a certain position. And from the chairperson and the Secretariat perspective, although they want ambitious and progressive agreements, on a working basis, they just want clarity. They want to know what's going on in the heads of the delegates and what they actually want. And so in that sense, when a delegation has a very hard line on something, like the US had on many issues in the last 4 years, because the delegates just didn't have a mandate to make any decisions on them, or their only mandate was just to not agree to things, it's very clear. So you have a very clear actor in the room. So when it comes to the puzzle that the chairperson and the Secretariat face, you didn't feel any antagonism. It even maybe made matters easier. That was the bureaucratic side. I know the question was thinking about the politics. I just think broadly, it's really positive to have them back in. And yeah, that I don't think it will I also don't think it did a lot of damage these 4 years, sadly, because it's a very slow process. And even though the delegates didn't have clear mandates, it's so technical stuff that I think delegations with even administrations that are maybe not interested in issues can do things, because they are the ones that understand the technicalities, and they're the ones reporting back. So I think the US delegation might have been able to do things that, if they sat down with the administration and explained exactly what was happening, or the politicians in power, they wouldn't have necessarily liked it. So it's complicated.
That's really fun. Great. Well, Magnus, thank you so much. We are moving over to a conference as a class in a few moments here. I just want to thank you so much for this really unique perspective on what the work behind these really important agreements looks like. And your really sort of brilliant mind in analyzing those. So thank you for taking the time in the waning Icelandic sunset. So thank you very much. And everybody else, I will see you in the next Zoom room or Facebook Live or whatever it is we're doing. I will stay on for anybody who has any questions. Otherwise, have a great week ahead. Take care. And thanks again, Magnus. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for having me and for all the great questions. Good luck with your studies. And my email was somewhere here. There's my email, and Jesse also has it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How do I get out of this meeting? That's the next question. Okay, I found it.
A button that says end.
Dr. O'Reilly,
Mhm.
do you know how long the conference is?
Next week,
Or no, sorry, this one that we're going to.
45 minutes.
Okay.
11:45 to 12:30. It's not mandatory, just recommended.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just had a quick question, Professor O'Reilly.
Mhm.
I started working on my poster presentation, and I was wondering if we're allowed to use the same introduction and thesis on our poster as we did in our white paper.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Wonderful.
It's all building blocks.
That's what I figured. I just wanted to make sure.
Thank you. Yeah. There's always that question of, are you plagiarizing yourself or? Yeah,
Exactly.
No, you can use it as a building block. It's all meant to accrue.
Okay, wonderful. See you soon.
Take care. Bye, Lucy. Hi, Amy. Do you have a question? All right. I don't hear from you. So I'm going to close this out.